I know we've got several folks who are traveling this week. We've also got several folks who are sick right now and want to keep those in our thoughts and our prayers, certainly. But we're glad you're here, and we do have visitors here, and we're glad you're here with us as well. Got Jimmy Carver here with us tonight, and I've known Jimmy for a long, long time. Jimmy, this is before I knew him, preached years and years ago at Nat Hill. That's where he started out. But then how I met him was he came and did a homecoming at Pleasant Knoll, where my dad was an elder for many years and still attends there. They don't have elders there at this point, but he still attends there, or will again whenever he gets out of NHC. Jeff, I know you got some kinfolk over there as well. But that's where Jimmy was for a good while, and that's where I met him. And so we go back to the late 90s, so close to 30 years. And then we were students together at the Nashville School of Preaching. He is now at the Florence Church of Christ, and he's been in Rutherford County for a number of years. I've known him for, like I say, for all these years, and I've never known him not to be true to the gospel. So I know that we're going to hear a good lesson tonight. I'm going to turn it over to him now.
Thank you, John. Good evening. It is good to be here. I wrote John, I guess just yesterday, and I said, how should I dress? And he said, well, it's pretty laid back. He said, I would say tie would be optional. And so I didn't wear a tie, and it made me think, and I always like to kind of start off with maybe a little bit of humor. I might be wrong after I tell this, but I don't know if you've ever heard about the fellow that went, he had heard all about this great restaurant, but nobody had ever told him that it was coat and tie required. And he got there, and he did have to have a jacket on, but he didn't have a tie. And the maitre d' told him, said, we adhere to that strictly. You cannot come in. So he just kind of left very disappointed, but he went to his car and he thought, maybe I have a tie in the car somewhere. And he looked in the front, under the seat, in the back seat. And then he opened his trunk and he kind of had a brainstorm. And he said, that will work. So he pulled out a pair of jumper cables and he wrapped them around his neck. And he walked back in and he said, will this do? And he said, we're going to let you pass this one time. He said, but while you're here, don't you be starting anything. So there you go. Whether you think that's humor or not, that's about as good as I got. But I do go way back. My very first regular work was at Nat Hill. And we lived between, that was when my wife and I were married. So that was our very first home, everything. We lived between a cornfield and a cemetery. It was quiet at our place with both of us growing up right kind of in downtown Murfreesboro. But we went from there over to Pleasant Knoll and then wound up back in Murfreesboro where I have been ever since. So I appreciate the invitation on behalf of John and the elders. And I am very happy to be here tonight. Going way back to that time, I know my wife used to come over with some of the members there at Nat Hill to Tullahoma. I forgot why they came, craft fairs or something. I don't remember what it was, but that's the connection. But my personal connection to Tullahoma that always makes me reminisce, and I had to tonight. We got here relatively early, and I had to go over and make sure I could find old Grider Stadium. And I did. Some of my favorite memories ever. I played high school baseball at Murfreesboro Oakland High School. And we didn't have a lighted field. In fact, my first 3 years, we didn't have a field. We played our home games at the VA hospital in Murfreesboro. But my senior year, we got a field, but we didn't have lights. In my junior and senior year, we did pretty well. Got to like the Final Four in the state and hosted several playoff games. But we didn't have a home field with lights. And so our home field was Grider Park. My coach and Coach Mathis were very good friends, and he allowed us to use. So other than being either at the VA or at the field at Oakland, I actually probably played more home games at Tullahoma Field than I did the field at Oakland because I only played on it for 1 year. So I went over tonight and kind of just had a moment just to reflect back because I had some Really good memories. So thank you again for being here. Well, I know getting into our lesson, I know the overall theme, and I want you to know I'm getting to that age where sometimes you know what you meant, but it doesn't really come out the way you meant to say it. And most of the time, I've heard of congregations having a summer series. And I guess you would call this a fall series. So I told someone the other day, and I was as serious as I could be. And they looked at me kind of funny, and I couldn't figure out why. I told them I was speaking at the Grundy Street Summer Fall Series. And they looked at me and said, "What's a summer fall series?" And I said, "Well, I guess it'd just be a fall series that you mention it." But I'm so happy to be here. And I know overall your theme is struggles for today's Christians. I know on one hand it's easy to think, well, should we ever talk about the struggle of being a Christian? Let's just think about the positive. And it is so much. I've told people, and especially to young people, I try to, to really impress upon that if you'll stay faithful to God and His people, you will meet the very best people that you will ever know in your whole life. But I promise you that along the way, there will be some very rarely. There can be people even in God's family that may hurt your feelings, that may get mad at you, that may cause an obstacle to be placed before you. And being honest about it, we have to struggle to make sure we're not the one doing the obstacle building as well. But much more, it is just great to be a child of God. Probably my favorite little VBS song is the old song, "Isn't it grand to be a Christian? Isn't it grand?" So my topic in this series is tonight we're going to talk about the benefits of what we're doing right now, actually. The benefits of worship services. Whether it's Sunday morning Bible class, Sunday morning worship, Sunday evening worship, Wednesday night Bible study, vacation Bible school, whatever it is that brings us together with God's people, our brothers and our sisters in Christ, I want you to know it's really not a struggle if you love Jesus. But there is a way. And there are some who maybe do struggle with their presence. It doesn't always have to be, and it shouldn't be, but it can be. Some people struggle with the worship service because they get older. Their health begins to weaken. They may be, I will promise you, as John mentioned his dad, Russell, I know Russell well enough to know that tonight, now where he is, there's probably a whole lot of places he'd rather be than where he is. But one of them I know would be to be with the brethren. Remember a few years ago, I extended the invitation at Jefferson Pike. And probably our oldest member at the time, her husband was a gospel preacher for well over half a century of time. Sister Gladys Jones, bless her heart, she has now passed away. Her husband's name, if you don't know them, was Brother George Jones. And if you asked her when she would tell you that, and if you answered by saying George Jones, and she would say, yes, he was the one who could sing. And I said, now, Sister Gladys, I love me some possum music. So I don't know if I like that one or not, but she liked to use that as an attempt at being funny. But she responded to the invitation. And I'm not going to lie to you, she came down the aisle. If you had asked me at that moment, who is the least person here tonight that you thought might respond to the invitation, she would have been it. But here she come. And she sat down on the front row, and I whispered, and I said, Sister Gladys, what brings you to respond to the invitation? And she said, it is, and I'll paraphrase, but in essence, she said, it is killing me that I'm not able to attend faithfully like I have all my life. My health, just a lot of things. Now, listen, by that time, she was probably 80, probably around late 70s to early 80s. And she said, I do, this part I can remember so vividly, I do not like to miss the services of the church. And she was having to sometimes. She, her sister and her daughter, she was the only one of the three that had a driver's license. Even her daughter, who was probably in her 40s. I never really understood why she never had gotten her driver's license, but she hadn't. So the only time that they could attend was when Sister Gladys felt like not only getting up, but also that she was well enough to get in the car and drive them to services. So I've never forgotten that. So when John asked me to pick a subject, that story kind of popped into my mind. And I thought about Sister Gladys and how she said, it kills me. So that's one area where people sometimes suffer. They suffer with the ability. Sometimes people suffer with time constraints. Some people do sadly suffer with just a commitment and a dedication. I don't guess there's an elder or a preacher or even a Christian that is faithful to the Lord that hasn't somewhere along the way been asked the question, do I have to? You can fill in the blank. You know what's coming most of the time. It's usually either about Bible class or Sunday night or Wednesday night or whatever. Do I have to? And I mean this as kindly as I know how. We don't really even have to breathe. Now, I don't recommend not doing that. And you do have to breathe in order to remain alive. But I think most of us would answer that and say, well, whether I have to is really not the question. I want to. I desire to. And that's really the same thing that we think about. Now, my topic tonight is not, whether one has to attend and when and what and if. I'm not going to get off into that realm of the question. My statement to you tonight is going to be, and then from that statement, I'm going to have 4 things that I want to share with you that are benefits. Now, sometimes you'll hear a preacher say, this doesn't necessarily present to you a complete list. In other words, I may give you 3 points tonight, 4. And it may not be. Well, tonight I'm going to be a little bit different. I know it's not. In fact, I almost presented this topic tonight in a totally different passage and points and everything. So I know even in my limited knowledge that there's at least 8 because I'm presenting 4, and there were 4 if I had chosen a different passage. So there's at least 8. Honestly, I believe there's, who knows how many. Real quickly, I'll tell you what I was going to use. I was going to use the 23rd Psalm. Thought that'd be an interesting way to look at it. Go back to the Old Testament, and David there gives 4 benefits of being a child of God. 1, he's your shepherd. That means you get the blessing of protection. Secondly, he'll lead you to green pastures, so you get the blessing of nourishment. He leads you to still or calm waters, so you get the blessing of peace. And then he'll restore your soul, giving you the blessing of strength. Well, that works. And I think those are 4 pretty good benefits to being with God's people and worshiping together and studying together and praying together and just being together. But the more I thought about it, I kind of took a different turn. And I looked at it where it would be applicable, I guess, to us as New Testament Christians to go to more of a New Testament source. And that's what I want to do tonight. So some may struggle to receive the full measure of benefit of attending the services of the church. Tonight, I want to consider with you at least these four things that you, I believe, will be reminded of. I'm not going to teach you anything tonight that you didn't already know. But sometimes it's as beneficial to be reminded of something you already knew than it is to try to teach something that you didn't know. Now, I reflected back to my old high school days. My coach was Coach Jack Jolly. Coach Jolly just passed away a few months ago. He was 93 years old. And I can remember back, and that's been now coming up on 50 years ago, he used to tell people all the time, I teach this bunch using the KISS method. I don't know if you've ever heard that. KISS. Now, he would always tell us, keep it simple, stupid. Well, I don't like using that. That sounds a little hurtful to say it that way. So I just say, keep it simple, students. Remind me. I do better probably just to be reminded of things that I knew. And I think that's what tonight's lesson is more so going to do. But number one, one of the greatest benefits of attending on a regular basis the worship services of the church, happiness, joy. Another favorite VBS song. I've got the joy, 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 joy. I get the right number of joys down in my heart. Man, it is good to be a Christian. And I think we need to be reminded of that sometimes. In fact, you know what? When I thought about this in presenting the lesson tonight, I thought about it. Think about the world we're living in tonight. Man, I'd almost ask the question, is there anybody happy anywhere? The whole world just seems angry, mad, divided, angry. And I don't believe God wants his people to be that way. In fact, I'll tell you, many years ago, one of my favorite cartoon characters, probably my favorite, is Snoopy. I love Snoopy. Interestingly enough, I like it, but I was never a huge just Peanuts fan. I think partly because I always felt a lot like Charlie Brown, and I didn't want to think that was, but I loved Snoopy. But I saw a poster one time about Snoopy, and it was, well, there's two or three that kind of come to mind, but one of them was, he was walking away and he said, and I'll use this one, he said, it doesn't matter if you win or lose. And then at the bottom it said, until you lose. And that's kind of the way I think the world is living by. They just feel like they lose, I guess. And I'm not trying to answer for other people, but when you live in a world that everybody seems angry and upset and just kind of downtrodden, it's hard not to be. What a great tool of evangelism. Another one, and the one I probably should have used first, but another one that was a Snoopy saying, he said, smile, and people will wonder what you've been up to. You know what? I promise you this. In the world you and I are living in, if you just give the appearance of being happy and content and joyful, you're going to gain the attention of people you work by and live next door to and do business with, because they're going to see that that's quite different than the normal greetings that we get one to another today. I've only been twice, but the very first time that I ever had the opportunity, and both times I was there for just literally a few hours, not extended at all, to go to New York City. I had people on both occasions said, please don't get up there and act like you do down here. And they meant by that, my kids will even tell you, my dad will talk to anybody. We were in Florida one year on vacation. We were going out to eat one night. We were on the way to the car, and there were these two ladies, and they were going to their car, and they looked over at us, and it was me and my wife and my three kids, and those two ladies said, "Hey, Jimmy, where are you heading?" And one of my kids said, "How do those people know who you are?" I said, "Oh, we've been talking down by the pool. We've been talking." One of the ladies worked with underprivileged kids in New York City. Well, see, I didn't know if I'd ever get to New York City. And so, you know what I did when I got up there? I just talked to people like I did when I talked down here. Now, maybe if you're there for more than a few minutes or hours, you might get yourself in some trouble. But I guess at the end of the day, my kids probably are right. I'll talk to just about anybody. I want to learn something about them. They may very well be from a place I'll never get to go, and I'd like to learn something about there. And so I like people, and I like to learn about people and talk to people. And I know sometimes I go too far and you know find out that they're ready to not be talking to me anymore. But I'd rather that come up than somebody ever look at me and find out later that I lay claim to being a child of God or a gospel preacher and acted like I didn't want anything to do with them. I love the old saying, people aren't going to really care how much you know until they know how much you care. And they're not going to really care about your Jesus till they know you have a concern about them and your Jesus. So be happy. Man, what a great benefit of being a Christian. You can make all the difference in the world in someone's life. And when we ask the question, is anybody happy? Let me answer that question by saying, I know one group that very much should be, and that's God's people. I mean, Christians have every reason in the world to be happy. And in fact, I would rather use the word, maybe I should have from the beginning, be joyful, because you can be joyful in any circumstance. I think people of the world have a really difficult time sometimes if they see someone who truly believes in their heart that someone in their family, in their circle, has passed away, but you feel confident that they were a faithful child of God, and you're joyful. Your heart's broke, you're sorrowful, you're in grief, but joy has not ran away from you. And I think people of the world sometimes almost look and say, I don't get it. What a great way to say, no, you don't. But I'd love to talk to you about someone that can make you get it, that will make you understand. So what do we use the word happiness or joyful? Well, what passage can you think of that may bring that down to us? I can't think of anything better than the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus speaks, and we've come to know them as the Beatitudes. I like to call them differently. Instead of the Beatitudes, I like to call them the Be-attitudes. I know it's almost the same, but it's saying have an attitude of being. Now, I'm not going to go through each and all of them. We know many of them. I think there are 8. But he said, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are those who are meek, blessed are the peacemakers. I mean, he gives a list of those. But the word there is what's most important, and that is blessed. Because the word literally means happy, joyful. Interestingly enough, if you go through the book of Revelation, Matthew, the first book of the New Testament, Revelation, the last book of the New Testament, there are 7 Beatitudes in the book of Revelation. They're not just packed together in one compact lesson text, but they're there. There's 7, and that's important because, especially in Revelation, the number 7 indicates perfectness, completion. And so he presents a manner in which he says, in the complete way, you can be happy. You can be joyful. Now, there are things about being a Christian that can be a challenge to us to be happy. I imagine the ones that the book of Revelation was written directly to, it probably was pretty tough. In fact, we read where God said, I hear your cries. It was almost as if God was saying, I can smell the blood that you are shedding by being persecuted. And there are moments that it's difficult to just be delirious. It's not always in the Christian journey being happy in spite of the circumstances of life. What I'm saying, it doesn't rob us from feeling pain. It doesn't remove worry about your children or your health or your loved one's health, or maybe your job's on shaky ground. Maybe your marriage is not where you want it to be. Many things where it is normal. But that's the greatest thing about the difference between being just having a good time. Oh, listen, go down. Well, let me rephrase that. You can go down. I don't recommend it. But go down on Broadway in Nashville, Tennessee. I do not, unless it's really, every now and then I'd like to catch a Preds game, something like that. But I wouldn't want to just go down there on a regular basis. But I'll promise you, there's a lot of people down there that you could say it in the way, boy, they're really having a good time. But a lot of their good times, they won't feel near as good when they wake up in the morning. And a lot of their good times lead to really terrible times. So I wouldn't ever go down there and say, look at all of the joyful moments these people are having. No, that's different. God's people find joy even in the midst. So why is it important for us to gather together? 4 reasons. 1, be joyful. And this is because it helps us in so many ways. And I know our time's going to be limited, so I'm going to be real quick. Number 1, it helps you to get to know yourself. It reminds you, not more so who you are, but when we're together as God's children, it is a great reminder of whose we are, who we belong to. Number 2, it helps us to understand what really is important. Now, I presented partly this lesson Sunday at Florence. Not really even these parts, just more so the introduction that I wanted to I'm going to come back and look at each of these in a more extended format throughout the rest of this month. But one of the things I pointed out that in life, there are always things that I divide into 3. 1 are things that are important. Then there are things that are more important than that. And then there's one thing that is the most important. There are things important. And then there are things that are more important. Your family, your friends. But what is most important? Your relationship to God. And so when we gather together, it reminds us of that. Thirdly, it helps us to develop trust in God. Isn't that a great thing? I love the old story about the guy that had a wheelbarrow. And he was standing on the banks of Niagara Falls. And he had a rope stretched from one side of the falls all the way to the other. And a crowd began to gather. And he asked the question, who among you believe I can push this wheelbarrow from this side of the falls all the way to the other sides? And in unison, the crowd yelled, I do, I do. And he looked and he said, all right, who will be the first to get into the wheelbarrow? And suddenly hands began to drop. Isn't it great to know God holds a wheelbarrow that we can indeed say, I will, because I know in whom I believe. And I know him. I know him. And so absolutely, to be reminded of the brevity of life. This world doesn't last. You know what? I got a really good nudge of that. I stood there tonight and I looked at that field and I remembered some really good times, and that was when it hit me. That was almost 50 years ago. It's about 45 years ago. 1978, 1979. And I thought, wow, that happened quickly. We need to be reminded. And being with God's people helps us to remember the spiritual things. And they remind us of that. And then number 5, it reminds us of the power of faith. All right, let's move on to the second benefit, or time's really going to get away. The second benefit of being together is to be able to grow in maturity. You know, I can't help but think maybe the greatest verse is when Paul, writing to the church at Corinth, who had a lot of difficulties, had a lot of problems and issues. And I believe there's a passage that we don't use in a more direct way, that this is just to me, that maybe Paul really kind of hits the nail on the head of what was underlying many of their issues. I'm not going to say every single one of them, but somewhat, because there's a point in which Paul said, when I became a man, I put away childish things. Now, they had issues with a lot of things. Lord's Supper, marriage and divorce, preacheritis. I mean, they had issues in a lot of different ways. But it seems to me that Paul was saying, if you want to fix a lot of these, here's just a little general nudge of advice. Grow up. You need to mature. You know, I know that there's still so much about the Word of God that I can learn. I sit at the feet of men at the School of Preaching. John said we went, we did. I'm still going. I've got to be the longest attending student in the history. I'm not even going for any. They made it clear to me. They presented a certificate of completion. Then they came up with something called the preacher track, and I finished that. And when I got my second certificate, Brother Mike Green said, "We ain't graduating you again." And I said, I didn't think you would. But Don's brother wanted to go, and I started going back just to him. And I learned every single week to be able to sit down and listen to people. Phil Sanders was one I took many classes under. Brother Tom Holland. But at the same time, because of those classes and because of study, personal study, I'm not where I used to be. Now, I need to keep growing. But I do believe that I am much better in my knowledge and in my ability to present that than I was. You know, I actually found, John, I don't know if you've ever done this. If you do, throw it away. Don't listen. It'll kill you. But I found an old cassette tape. Now, there's a few people in here that are looking at me like, I don't even know what that is. Just ask your parents. They'll show you a picture or something. Or Google it. You Google it. But it was me preaching from mid-80s. I listened to about 5 minutes, and I thought, that's awful. I was self-critiquing. I was like, that's terrible. But I still need. We don't ever stop growing. But you know what? Being with God's people is one of the greatest ways. I promise you this, even if you're an elder, preacher of the gospel, and you're teaching a Bible class, blow your socks off sometimes when the little sister sitting near the back comes up with a point, and you're sitting there going, I've read that verse 1,000 times, and I never saw that. I never thought about that. And you learn. You know why? Because in that realm, at least, she's grown more than you. She's more mature than you are. I'm amazed that when I was 17, 18 years old, and I'd get to a passage about raising children, well, I just skimmed right on through that. That didn't apply to me. And then suddenly we had some kids, and then, oh, it was awful, but they become teenagers, and then it was not just horrible. And man, when I came to then, I tried to find every commentary I could find. I asked questions. But what I learned to do is listen to the people who'd fought the battles. And it helped me immensely. And now, as a grandfather, I try my best to impart some wisdom to young couples. When you're going to perform a wedding, maybe, or something like that, and you try to talk to them about things that now you can see that you didn't see then. You had no reason to see. And so because of that, being able to grow in maturity, It's 1 Corinthians 13, by the way, verse 11. And I love one of the versions says, when I became a man, I stopped childish behavior. Now, I know some of the versions, you have to be really careful, but that's one that's, and I forget which one it is, but I kind of like that. When I growed up, I stopped childish behavior. If you don't mature, you'll never stop behavior. And being in Bible class, and on Sunday morning, and on Sunday nights, and on Wednesday nights, and in other times that you're together, that's when you begin to grow in the faith. It is not in a sense, but in essence, it is just the opposite of being immature. And I don't say that just to be oversimplified, but it comes down to the realization of something. The world that you and I live in teach and practice not being wise. Even the most intelligent on this earth without God in their lives are very immature. It is in the body of Christ. Maturity will result when we decide, as Paul put it on one occasion, to transform our minds. Listen to Romans 12, verse 2. Do not be molded by this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may discover God's good and acceptable will. Let me give you a few things real quickly. And there's 7 or 8 of these, but I'm literally just going to quote them off real quickly. I just want you to hear them. How do we do that? How do we mature? We put on the tender mercy of God. We bear and forgive one another. We put love on. We are thankful. We let the word of God dwell in us. We let all we do in word and deed be in the name or by the authority of Jesus. We don't live like the world lives. We don't allow anger to rule us. We learn to control our tongue. All of those are things that are unwise, that are immature. And the more we are with each other in settings of God's children, we will grow in our faith. Number 3, and quickly, the third benefit is spirituality. It is God's desire for His children. We cannot be sinless, but we absolutely can be faithful. And there is a path to spirituality. If you'll write this down, if you're taking notes, 1 Peter 2, verses 4 and 5. And the pathway to that is this. Set your mind on the spiritual things of the earth. Don't be all tied up into just the things of this world. Walk by the Spirit, not by the flesh. Put on the deeds, put the deeds of the flesh to death. Try to restore those who are erring. Galatians 6, verse 1. Strive to be filled with spiritual understanding. Colossians 1 and verse 9. And then offer spiritual sacrifices unto God. Number 4, real quickly, because it kind of encapsulates all of what we've talked about. One of the greatest benefits of being with God's people when we gather together in the worship services of the church is assurance. Don't you love the old hymn? Now, I like some of the newer songs too. I really do. But I pray that no congregation gets so involved in all of the newer songs that we don't remember some of the old ones. Because in many ways, and I'm not saying this to offend anybody, I think it's just true. It's the old hymns that I think are more doctrinally minded. That's okay. We're to worship God in spirit and in truth. So a mix of that is, I think, the best way to be it. But how can we not listen to the beauty of the words, blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine. Isn't it good to be assured of what awaits us? Is there any place else where we get just a little glimpse of heaven than when we're together as God's family. I don't know how many of you have ever gone down to the Diana singing. I remember on one occasion, Donna and I got to go to a family conference out in Dallas, Texas, and there was about 2,500 people in just one banquet room of a hotel. Man, the singing, unbelievable. But I already told you about how many people were there. It was about 2,500. John saw a glimpse of heaven and he said it was a number that could not be counted. Wonder what that singing is going to sound like. Isn't it good to be together and be assured that while this world is filled with good and bad, as a Christian, there are really good things that we get to see and be a part of. And yet always to be reminded of the assurance that there's better coming. I always mess this little joke up every time, which means I'm going to mess it up right now. I know I do every time. But have you ever heard the story of the man who was being buried with a fork in his pocket? And the principle of it is that he always wanted to, when they had the church fellowship dinners, he always stuck an extra fork in his pocket because he said, I want to make sure I've got a fork for the dessert. I want to be ready for the dessert. I'm diabetic, which means I want that fork too. Someone asked me one time, said, why is it most diabetics seem to love sweets? I said, how do you think we got to be diabetics? Love sweets? Those things go hand in hand. That's why. But isn't that a great thought? And he wanted this. He had asked for this, that at his death, he wanted people to know, I'm going to the dessert line now. This world has had some beautiful, good moments, but they'll pale in comparison to where God. John 14, he says it that way, doesn't he? Don't let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in my Father's house. There are many mansions. If it weren't so, I'd have told you, I go to prepare a place for, that means for me, for those who are his. What is the result of blessed assurance? Faith, knowledge, self-control, perseverance, godliness, brotherly kindness, and love. Way back in the beginning of this study, I told you it's not really about answering or even entertaining the question, do I have to? I believe it comes down to a question when people ask that. And I often will answer their question that way. First of all, I want you to do what you would rather be doing. Where would you rather be? That's the heart of the question. It's not, do I have to be here? I want you to tell me where you'd rather be. Where will your life be more blessed? Where will you be made more whole? Where will you be edified more? And I guess at the end of the day, I'll just be kind of a little bit blunt. On the day of judgment, the last thing I want to do is to explain to God why I so desired to spend eternity with him. When the story of my life was hard-pressed to spend just a little bit of the time I was given each week with his people. I promise you this, every time we gather together, your life will be blessed. Every single time. I can't be the only one. But have you ever came on Sunday night or Wednesday night? You had a really bad day at work, a long day, you're tired, and you really, we're going to be honest about it. On the way home, you're thinking, man, we shouldn't have to go to church tonight. I'm so tired. When you have those moments, how many times did something unique happen that night in service that immediately you said, I am so glad I was here? And you go back toward the house and man, you're motivated and pumped up and you just feel like you could take on the world. That's the blessing. As we close, I know we have a song that has been selected to encourage you tonight. If you're subject in any way. I hope there's a way in which we realize that we're all subject to the invitation every time we meet, every one of us. Someone asked me, how many responses to the invitation did you have yesterday? I always like to tell them, as many as we had people there. If we had 90, I hope there were 90 responses. Now, let me tell you what I hope almost all the responses were. I hope it was from a faithful child of God resolving that they were going to go back out into the world and remain a faithful child of God. But that's a response to say, I'm being as faithful as I can and I'm going to keep right on. But maybe tonight you have a need. Maybe you feel as if you're not where you need to be and you've drifted away. Maybe there's someone tonight who has never obeyed the gospel and needs to come on. If you have such a need, it would be our privilege tonight to help you address those. Stand and sing.